And his premise was simple. He drew on stories from Scripture as well as current events, and he said, you know, sometimes it is easier for us to feel cynical. The easiest thing in the world, in fact, is to conclude that nothing can change. We look around and we see poverty and we see famine and we see unemployment, we see violence and strife and conflict, and it's so much more comfortable for us to pull back into ourselves and just to say that's the way the world is, and we're just going to have to deal with it. And yet what he said was that what is truly audacious, what requires boldness and a willingness to risk, is to have hope, to believe in things not seen, to believe that there are better days ahead, to insist that the world as we find it is not the world as it has to be, and that if men and women of goodwill are able to come together and mobilize around agendas for change, that in fact we can reimagine our world and bring about a new day. And I love that phrase. I loved the idea because the audacity of hope suggests that it's not just wishful thinking. It's not that we ignore racism and pretend that it doesn't exist, or we ignore conflicts and pretend that they don't exist, or we ignore poverty and assume just because the stock market is setting records that somehow everything's okay. Instead, what it calls upon us to do is to look squarely at our situation, at our condition, and yet still move forward. And it strikes me that the American people are ready for that idea, are ready for that message, because what we've seen is over the last 10 years a politics that has focused almost entirely on feeding that cynicism and exploiting our fears and seeking divisions among us. And there's a reason for that, because those who are powerful have an incentive for everybody to feel cynical, because if you're cynical, you're not going to do anything about it. If you're cynical, then you're going to leave government to those who have special interests. But as I've been traveling around the country over the last several weeks, what I've been struck by is that people are in the mood for a change. There's a seriousness. There is a seriousness of purpose right now among all people, black, white, southern, northern. There's a sense that the challenges that are upon us are so serious that we can't afford the sort of slash and burn, negative campaigning, say nothing, but make a lot of noise style of politics that we've become accustomed to. You know, it's almost become like WWF wrestling. You know, it's a lot of smackdowns and snarling and people making faces at each other, but there's no substance. And what folks are hungry for right now is substance. They look at our healthcare system and they say, how can it be that we as a nation spend more money than any nation on earth on healthcare, and yet we have 46 million people without health insurance? And those of us who have health insurance see their co-payments and deductibles and premiums going up, so that families are burdened. Small businesses can't afford to provide health insurance to their workers, and large businesses are burdened in their attempt to be competitive with companies from other nations. So, why can't we, if we're spending that much money, find some intelligent ways to negotiate for cheaper drug prices, or institute electronic billing, and so that we're cutting down on administrative costs? And why can't we provide coverage for all people? Because we know that if children have coverage, then they're less likely to go to the emergency room for asthma and diabetes. Why can't we do that? That's not ideological, that's not Republican or Democrat, that's just common sense. So then folks take a look at the education system, and they say, we're always talking about education, and yet we still have an education system that was designed for the agricultural age. Hasn't changed much in the last 100 years. And yet we know that the economy now is such where young people, if they're not trained in math and science, they're not going to be able to compete for the high-wage jobs of the future. And so why wouldn't we redesign our school system and get beyond this argument about is it more money or is it reform, is it parents or is it teachers? It's all of the above. The schools need more money. Teachers need to be trained. Parents need to do their jobs. Our students need to take it upon themselves to understand that education isn't a passive activity. It's something that you have to actively want. So why aren't we moving forward on that? Or they look at energy and they say, we know gas prices went down. Here's an interesting thing. I'm going around the country. Even though gas prices went down, everybody still wants an energy policy. And part of it is they know what happens right after the elections. It's going to go back up. They know that. They know ExxonMobil's not stupid. But they also know that we're sending $800 million to some of the most hostile nations on earth. That we're funding both sides on the war on terrorism. And they're also starting to think after the record heat and the weird weather and the tornadoes and the hurricanes, maybe there's something to this climate change. And since 10,000 scientists say there is, and there are 2 of them who say there isn't, they're both in the White House, we might decide that we want to do something about that. So why wouldn't we try to find more fuel-efficient cars and develop alternative fuels? And why wouldn't we do something like that? That doesn't have to be a source of bitter partisan argument. And then they look at Iraq and our foreign affairs, and they have come to understand that although we rallied around the president after 9/11, and rightfully so, because that was a trauma to our nation, that rather than lead us to a tough and smart foreign policy, we've gone down the road of a pretend to be tough and dumb foreign strategy, and the consequences have been enormous and have not been equally borne. They've been borne by young men and women who deserve better than what they've got and have seen their lives shattered. And so people say, we want to be the most powerful military on earth, but we understand that the might of our military has to be matched with the strength of our diplomacy and the power of our alliances. And so cumulatively, people are in a mood for change. And one of the things that I've come to the conclusion of and is reflected in this book is that the country is not as divided as our politics would make it seem. And that if we can find those common values and common ideals that cut across all our differences and try to focus on common sense, practical, non-ideological solutions to the problems we face, we're not going to solve all our problems instantly, but we can make progress. We can make progress. And the good news is that because the voters are paying attention, I think we have an opportunity to institute that kind of politics. Because one of the things that I firmly believe, and I talk about in this book, is that at their core, the American people are a decent people. They get confused sometimes. They listen to Rush Limbaugh. Mainly they're just busy, they're tired, they're not paying attention. They're not focusing each and every day on North Korea policy or what the latest budget numbers are. They've got too many other things to do in their lives. But when they do pay attention, they've got good instincts. And so the premise of this book is that let's find some areas of agreement that we can build on. Let's look at, for example, the issue of race and say to ourselves, we don't need to get in an argument about whether things are better now. Look, there's no doubt in my lifetime, I was born in 1961, that race relations have drastically improved. And those who would deny that, I think, make a mistake. The problem isn't that things have gotten better. The problem is that better's not good enough. And so let's focus on those things that we know need to still happen in terms of making sure that inner city children have genuine equal opportunity for education. We know the reforms that work, we just haven't tried them. We know that if we invest and give hope to ex-offenders, that their recidivism rate is going to go down.